Minister of Primary and Secondary Education, Ms. Amina Kunda, Chief Economist, Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning, and our own Albert Zufak, Chief Economist for the Africa region at the World Bank. The 16th edition of the Rwanda Economic Update focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on human capital development. The COVID-19 pandemic has had the world in its grip for just over a year now, with devastating consequences worldwide. Since the report of the first case on March 14, 2020, the government of Rwanda has swiftly and decisively put in measures to contain the spread of the virus, save lives, and mitigate the economic impact of the crisis. The response of the Rwandan government has been heralded the world over, but like the rest of the world, this has not been without consequences. The lockdown, social distancing, and increased costs associated with the COVID-19 pandemic have depressed trade transactions, reduced output, reduced employment, and increased poverty in Rwanda. The pandemic-driven rise in the fiscal deficit is increasing public debt, thus exacerbating existing challenges to sustainability and increasing the urgency of the shift from large public investments to private sector and human capital development as the main drivers of Rwanda's economic growth. The government instituted measures to mitigate the challenges posed by the pandemic, putting in place the Economic Recovery Plan to support households and firms, ramping up social protection programs to support the poorest and most vulnerable, and setting up remote learning to stem learning losses. The government's rapid response to the pandemic has succeeded in keeping the population share of new infections and of deaths well below that of most other countries. However, critical health services, particularly childhood immunization and nutrition services, have been disrupted, which is increasing stunting and preventable diseases within the population. The combination of poorer nutrition, limited health services, learning losses from school closures, and the likelihood that some children, particularly girls and children from poor households, may never return to school, will reduce incomes and productivity over the medium term. In its mission to end extreme poverty and promote shared prosperity, the World Bank is deploying a variety of instruments to support the government in addressing the challenges posed by this unprecedented crisis. $31 million in loans and grants to support emergency COVID response for the health, education, and agriculture sectors complement the World Bank's ongoing portfolio of $725 million, strengthening social protection programs, quality basic education, and skills in high-tech sectors, as well as much-needed nutrition services. This is just to underscore that the World Bank's financing and technical assistance is in step with the government's and the bank's common priorities. The World Bank is currently preparing another $500 million in projects that support vaccine procurement and deployment, financial support to medium, small, and enterprises, commercializing agriculture, and promoting digital inclusion, all part of Rwanda's support for a resilient recovery. But let us turn our attention to the Rwanda Economic Update and a few key priorities, which we hope will form the cornerstones for a resilient, sustainable, and inclusive recovery post-COVID-19. The first, the World Bank recommends that fiscal policy should be strengthened over the medium term by improving the government's revenue mobilization, expenditure allocation, and financial management. In short, by collecting more revenues and spending those revenues better. Second, urgent efforts are required to improve the resilience of the health system for essential health services and in light of the probability of future crises, as well as to prepare for the administration of the COVID-19 vaccine, which is not an easy undertaking. The third, implementing education policies that focus on reducing learning losses, specifically by protecting student health on return to school, tracking and supporting re-enrollment, targeting the most vulnerable, girls, the disabled, and students from poor families, and instituting remedial instruction and a remedial curriculum. The second, focusing on strengthening education systems, and by that I mean to improve accountability for learning outcomes, not just inputs, formation of quality education leaders, and subsector coordination, as well as skills formation that is informed by market demand. Finally, social protection policies. The crisis has underscored for us the fact that robust social protection systems are very effective at cushioning the population from shocks. Despite Rwanda's impressive administrative systems for providing social assistance, the pandemic has underscored the importance of continued improvement. We recommend the following priorities for Rwanda: expanding the Vision Umurenge program, improving poverty targeting of safety net programs for greater cost effectiveness. We see that by better targeting, the same resources can facilitate reaching a larger number of the poor. The third, scaling up the use of digital payments. And the fourth, building adaptive safety net systems that can be expanded quickly in the case of shocks. My colleague, Calvin Didiofak, who will follow later in the program, will speak in greater details on the findings in the REU. In conclusion, I very much look forward to what I hope will be a fruitful discussion of the challenges presented by the pandemic and the implications for government policy in terms of its efforts to save lives, to mitigate the immediate economic impact, and to shape the development strategy over the medium term. All eyes must be focused on a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable recovery for our beloved Rwanda. It is now with great pleasure that I introduce the Honorable Dr. Daniel Ngamije, the Minister of Health, who has been spearheading the government of Rwanda's impressive COVID-19 response. He was appointed Minister of Health in February 2020, and I joked when I first met him that he may not have taken on this assignment had he known how many sleepless nights he had had forthcoming. Minister, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we very much look forward to your keynote address. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you so much, Country Manager Roland. On all protocol observed, I'm so happy to share with you these key notes as a proof that I was appointed in February of the pandemic. I'm still around and live, so we can be resilient. It is a pleasure and an honor to participate to this very important discussion on the 16th Rwanda Economic Update by the World Bank, and reflects on protecting and promoting human capital in the post-COVID-19 world. I commend the tremendous work done by the World Bank Group of experts to analyze our country's recent economic development, prospects, and key policy priorities. In the last 12 months of COVID-19 pandemic, we have learned that this public health crisis was multidimensional, needing a multi-sectoral approach, and we have seen how it has an impact on the economy at the global, regional, and of course at the country level. The government of Rwanda has to control the pandemic and mitigate the pressure imposed to the health sector. Among these unusual measures include social distancing in public space, general and localized lockdowns. We can also add curfews, limitation in movement between districts. I think we all have in mind those measures were taken in the country. These measures in targeted sectors have had social and economic impact on communities working or very active in those sectors. It was a constant strive to balance both crises of health and the economy in the context of COVID-19 evolving situation. A few updates I would like to share with you from the main policy recommendation. Number one, regarding strengthening health security for further pandemic preparedness, we are enhancing the epidemiological surveillance at all levels and increasing testing capacity at the centralized level. Number two, for mitigating disruption in essential services and nutrition services, necessary efforts are implemented to ensure primary health care services are able to tackle both outbreaks and delivery of essential services during outbreaks. For strengthening health services, income support and monitoring, key recommendations for health services include to minimize the risk of infection in health facilities, especially among health personnel, to increase access to health appointments and medication to facilitate access to services, to use mobile phone messaging and telemedicine consultation in improvement to community health care platforms. Number four, to accelerate deployment of COVID-19 vaccine. Rwanda has developed the National Deployment and Vaccination Plan for COVID-19 vaccine. The plan contains a coordinated mid-sectoral efforts to ensure readiness in terms of adequate resources mobilization, vaccine-related logistics for vaccine rollout, and proper monitoring method, including pharmacovigilance after administration of the vaccine. Rwanda is part of the COVAX facility initiative, and we expect to receive up to 20% of vaccine covering 20% of our population. The first rollout of COVAX-19 vaccine is within this month, around the middle toward the end of February. And we expect to receive almost 1 million of doses through that facility as rollouts. Later on, we expect to receive up to 7 million of doses through COVAX facility. But we are also part of COVID-19 African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team called AVAT, where we expect to receive additional doses. We expect to receive up to 2.6 million doses from the application we made already through AVAT system. We expect to receive almost 500,000 from Pfizer, almost 1 million from AstraZeneca, and almost 1 million from Johnson & Johnson. This will allow us to vaccinate up to 1.8 people through this AU mechanism. But to reach 60% of the coverage we wish, and which is recommended by African Union, we need, in addition to COVAX facility and AU initiative, we need to continue to discuss with manufacturers of vaccine for getting more doses so that we can reach 60%. We count on the World Bank support for us to be able to get resources for funding those additional vaccine, in addition to what we expect to get as resources from African Bank through AU mechanism. To ensure optimal allocation for pandemic preparedness, the National Action Plan for Health Security developed a reference to Rwanda Joint Evaluation Score and highlighted gaps in the prevention, detection, and rapid response to public health threats. The government recognized the importance of improving health system for future adverse events, including pandemics. The estimated cost of this plan is $61.5 million US, which need to be mobilized both domestically and externally. Once again, we count on the support of the World Bank as one of the key partners of the government of Rwanda. I believe that by implementing this recommendation, we can mitigate actual socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 and be part of the recovery plan so that we can again start a new journey after controlling COVID-19. I thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister Daniel Gabije, for your very informative and insightful remarks. And congratulations for the great work being done to mitigate the pandemic results. Dr. Albert Zefak is the World Bank country chief economist for Africa region. Many of you might have heard of the famous Africa Pass biannual analysis of the macroeconomic outlook for the region. I know that a number of you have attended the launch of these reports several times in the past years. Dr. Zefak and his team are the people behind that publication. It is my pleasure to welcome Albert Zefak to briefly take us through the Africa Road to Recovery. Over to you, Dr. Zefak.
Very good. Good afternoon to all of you. It's a privilege for me to be speaking to you this afternoon. Honorable ministers, honorable guests, what a privilege to be discussing economic recovery and the road to recovery from COVID at this particular point in time in a country, Rwanda, that has actually shown the world another good example of how to manage crisis. I've been asked to reflect on the macroeconomic outlook for the continent. I've been asked to reflect on what is happening across the continent so that we can make connections with Rwanda, with the economic update that we are launching today. And one thing I wanted to share with you are three important messages. The first message is that despite a modest health impact, COVID-19 has actually had a devastating impact on African economies. Indeed, 2020 is going to be a first big recession in more than a quarter century. We're now projecting that 2020 would see a recession of GDP by a decline of GDP by more than 3.7% for sub-Saharan Africa. And because of that, a decade of progress is at risk. And this progress we've been making both on poverty and human capital may be completely wiped out if we do not stage a robust recovery. The second message I'd like to share with you is that the road to recovery will be long and perhaps steep. And the reason why it's going to be long and steep is because entering COVID, we were already facing significant macroeconomic and structural vulnerabilities, including fast accumulation of riskier and more expensive debt, deterioration in governance across the continent, decline in investment, especially foreign direct investment, and those vulnerabilities will only be exacerbated by COVID. The third message I would like to leave you with is that the road to recovery, to be robust, to be resilient, to be sustainable, must be paved with good policies, good economic policies. And from our perspective, good economic policies are not just those that address the short-term needs, but that build on a deep, inclusive productivity agenda. And that would we can sum up in 5 important priority actions in terms of policy. The first, and the country manager has mentioned, Roland has mentioned earlier, is restoring fiscal space. And this including debt relief beyond the debt service suspension initiative. The second policy option is to expand digital infrastructure and make the digital accessible to all, but also affordable, make it universal. The third policy entry point is a decisive shift from exporting raw materials to adding value to establishing regional value chains in the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, but also strive to join global value chains. That's how jobs will be created. The fourth important area is to enhance rural and urban connectivity, but also invest in cities as they are the source of innovation. They are the cradle of job creation. And fifth, we must take COVID as an opportunity to reinvent our service delivery, especially human capital service delivery. We must harness innovation and technology to not only rethink, but really revamp and reinvent how education is provided, how health services are provided. And if there is one silver lining from this COVID crisis, it's been the digital. Rwanda has made huge inroads in terms of digital. Let's make sure we embrace it and harness it to the fullest. Now, let me say a little bit more on the macro picture in Africa. Again, it is important in this year, 2021, to realize that the beginning of the year hasn't been as hopeful as we had hoped. The second wave of COVID is clearly pushing us into negative territories. Again, very likely a lower growth prospects, lower than we had anticipated in October. Yes, we can say that apocalypse has been averted in sub-Saharan Africa because of the fewer number of cases, but it's not over. The news this morning of the second of the variant, South African variant, resisting to the vaccine is one that is certainly quite preoccupying and may actually postpone the time at which we reach herd immunity when vaccines are started to be rolled out across the continent. So apocalypse has probably been averted, but it's not over yet. We need to continue, as the minister has said, keeping all the social distancing, all the measures to ensure we limit the spread of the virus. The second thing quite important here is that, and I probably want to share one slide with you. I'll share one slide with you here for you to see how this is playing for Africa. So on this slide, you can see that the impact on growth across sub-Saharan Africa is going to be extremely sharp. And in 2021, we may be back in terms of growth, but what is important to notice is that output would take many years to come back to the 2019 level. And with the news of the second wave, the variants, and the fact that it's going to be slow to roll out vaccines across Africa, it's clear that we're very likely going to be in our downside scenario here, where growth will only be marginally positive in 2021. And even in 2022, it is likely that we will still be below population growth. So it is likely that even if we see a rebound in growth, that we remain below per capita growth, we remain in negative territory for per capita growth. So we need to really continue to implement those policies to launch our recovery. The countries that are the most affected are those that are resource rich and tourism dependent, like Rwanda. And I'm sure Calvin will come back to that. But that deep impact is because, as I mentioned earlier, our countries have been accumulating debt, riskier debt, at a very fast pace coming to the crisis. We've also been seeing a decline in FDI, as you can see on this slide on the right side, on this right panel. From 2018, FDI has been already trending down across sub-Saharan Africa. Governance has not been improving. The latest Mo Ibrahim report is showing clear, declining trend, both in, quality of public administration, transparency, accountability, and the fight against corruption across the continent. It hasn't been improving significantly. And this is from our own CPIA indicator, CPIA score, where Rwanda performs extremely well. Rwanda is actually the top, country, the top IDA country in the world in terms of CPI performance. But this score on transparency, accountability, and the fight against corruption is one that is a challenge for all African countries. So the pandemic may erase all those hard-won gains, and if you can look at this, the right panel on this slide, you can see that by 2021. We may be back in terms of per capita income to the level of 2007. That would be more than 13 years of per capita growth erased because of this pandemic. And this is also going to be the case for human capital, which is the topic of this economic update. We project that between 32 and 34 million people may be pushed below the poverty line in sub-Saharan Africa because of this crisis. And the situation could worsen if there is a second wave, or if the situation continues to be extremely dire in our major trading partners. So let me use this last couple of minutes to tell you how we think of the recovery, the road to recovery in the World Bank. And this is how we are hoping African countries can stage that recovery. From our perspective, three complementary transformations must underpin this road to recovery. The first is a technological transformation. We just talk about the digital. The second is a sectoral transformation, which is adding value to our products and implementing regulatory reforms that would allow private investment to thrive. The third is spatial transformation. And on spatial transformation, it's about ensuring that we better connect rural areas to urban areas. We better invest in infrastructure and in connective infrastructure that would lead to an increase in productivity in agriculture, investing in our cities. On supporting these three pillars are investment in human capital, investment in infrastructure And the key infrastructure that is complementary to the digital is obviously energy. There is no digital without energy, and that's extremely important. The third is the macro framework, and again, ensuring macro stability, including raising enough revenue to support those investments in human capital and other areas are important. Last but not least, we must continue to focus on institutional reforms. We must continue to invest in accountability, transparency for good governance. All these three pillars and the foundations combined would lead to inclusive productivity growth, which are a condition for more production for export and domestic consumption, and more and better jobs for the Rwandese and for Africans. So from this framework, we got 5 entry points on which I would close. We need to restore fiscal space. And this is about domestic revenue mobilization. It's about debt relief, implementing the common framework, the G20 common framework. But on domestic revenue mobilization, it's also not just about expanding the tax base, but it's about efficiency. It's about ensuring that we close the loopholes in tax codes. It's about ensuring that we limit illicit flows of revenues, that we better design and implement taxations, including of land and property, that are more inclusive than VAT, for example. It's about rethinking domestic revenue mobilization as well, leveraging the digital. Second entry point is on the digital. Rwanda is pretty well advanced in implementing infrastructure, but we do see across the continent still the need for making connectivity universal and affordable. There is a clear evidence that internet remains expensive in African countries compared to the rest of the world. And regulatory reform can help. We need to obviously invest in access to energy. Access to electricity in some of our countries is still below 40%, which means 6 Africans out of 10 do not have access to electricity in average. That cannot continue. We need to address this. We need to really embrace the Continental Free Trade Agreement in Africa to expand markets and to attract and nurture more private investment. This is going to be critical for job creation, and job creation is the most decisive path to poverty reduction and sustained recovery. We need to invest in our cities to boost agricultural productivity and reallocate efficiently our resources from the least productive areas to the most productive activities as well. And that would boost productivity as well. Last but not least, we need to take COVID as an opportunity to reinvent services, to reinvent the way we deliver services to our populations. In human capital, it is probably time for us to rethink how we teach, how we educate. The classroom of the future is already here. The digital has shown us that number of things that were actually in the realm of the dream are already happening. And we need to do that rethinking, that reinventing of human capital service delivery with a gender focus. We need to have the little girl, but also the secondary school girl in mind when we are rethinking and launching those reforms. If we work together, and the World Bank is happy to help, we're always here to work with governments, and we've worked with the government of Rwanda in the past, and we will continue to work alongside the government to make sure Rwanda stages a robust, resilient, and sustainable recovery. With this, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zupak, for taking us through so quickly and yet so thoroughly through the road to recovery for this region. It's indeed comforting to learn that at least some recovery is possible and actually happening. Mr. Calvin Zebanze is our new country economist and one of the authors of the 16th edition of the Rwanda Economic Update. Calvin is taking us through the content of this report. Over to you, Calvin.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for joining this afternoon. Thank you, Albert, our Chief Economist. Very much appreciate your presence today to support this event. So let me share my presentation with you. Maybe before going to this presentation, allow me to acknowledge the many contributions that we received preparing this report. I would like to start by thanking my colleague Peace, who collect and coordinate the work of this report with me. Also like to acknowledge the contribution of our colleague from the education team led by Huma, our colleague from the social protection team led by Ramia, and the colleague from the health team led by Miriam. I also like to thank our macro modeling team, Hassan and Lilith, as well as the poverty team. This also allow me to really say my appreciation to the government for very useful meetings and comment that we received, in fact, in preparation of this report. So, just to share the slide with you, so the presentation is going basically to be organized around 3 main points. The first one is about discussing the impact of the COVID-19 in Rwanda. The second one would be about the response, the government response, and we will close the presentation with the way forward. Maybe before going through the presentation, just a couple of key messages that we have here. The first one is really that the pandemic hit the economy very hard, and this at the very worst moment where Rwanda was enjoying very robust growth, and it hit the economy where it's really hurt on the strategic growth sector, the tourism sector, as the chief economist just underlined. The second message is that the crisis has severe implications for the household, and we are seeing that there is important potential for lasting impact on household welfare and poverty. The third message is that this crisis is having important disruptions, creating disruption, the delivery of healthcare and education service. And this, in fact, could be a major threat for our medium to long-term productivity in the country. The fourth message is that the government of Rwanda, in fact, implemented a very swift and robust response that actually saved lives and contributed significantly to attenuate the social and the economic impacts of this pandemic. Let me go to the first part of the presentation about the impact. The Rwanda Economic Update covers the economic impact, the household impact, and the human capital impact of the crisis. About the economic impact, the graph that you have here is really highlighting what everyone has been saying, the severity of this crisis. Before the pandemic, the last decade, Rwanda was enjoying one of the strongest growth performance in Africa. Actually, only Ethiopia was doing better than Rwanda. And the growth performance of 9.4% that Rwanda recorded in 2019 was the best of the continent. And when we were starting, in fact, in 2020, the projection of the growth for the country for Rwanda was 8.1%, very reasonable projection given the past performances. But what is that we have now with the COVID and the lockdown and the restriction of the movement? So you can see here, in fact, the last part of this chart showing us the evolution of GDP growth on a quarterly basis. You can see, in fact, the GDP growth going down by more than 12% the second quarter of 2020. We have another contraction of more than 3%, in fact, in the third quarter. As a result of this, the government is now estimating, in fact, a contraction of 0.2 for 2002. And I have to say that in the Rwanda Economic Update report, some of the scenarios that we have are even indicating that this, in fact, the result could be worse than just minus 0.2%. Another way, in fact, to analyze the severity and the severity of this crisis, in fact, on Rwanda, is to just make the comparison with other African countries. The graph you have here, in fact, is showing us the difference between the growth projection that was forecast at the beginning of 2020 and what was recorded at the end of the year, the actual growth that we are seeing. So you can see that in the case of Rwanda, we have 8.3, a loss of 8.3 percentage point of growth. This put Rwanda among the top 10 most affected countries in the continent. As the chief economist just said, in fact, you can see there's some pattern, in fact, emerging from the most impacted countries here. You have countries like Congo, Botswana, South Africa, who depend heavily, in fact, on natural resources. But most of these countries, Seychelles, Mauritius, Cape Verde, they are the countries that depend, like Rwanda, in fact, on tourism. As you know, Rwanda invested massively in this sector and was actually having some very good results. Before the pandemic, Kigali was considered as the second most popular destination for a conference, in fact, in the continent. When the crisis arrived, you are seeing here the number we have here is a 40% decline in hotel and restaurant subsector. So what about the impact of this crisis on household? I would say that the severity of the crisis on the economy is the same thing we are seeing, in fact, at the level of household. The graph you have here is showing us the loss of real consumption, in fact, of household as a result of this crisis. Basically, this graph is capturing that the loss of employment. We saw in Rwanda during the lockdown that the participation to labor market was 5% less than what it used to be. We saw that the unemployment rise from 13% to 22%. We saw that even for those who remain in the labor market, they were declaring in the different household survey, in different labor survey, that 65% of them had to face some level of wage salary cut. So all these factors are being reflected here in this real consumption here. This is for 2020. And a couple of messages from this graph. The first one is to say that all categories of household are being affected by this crisis. The second message is that the urban area is being relatively more affected than the rural area. The obvious reason for that is because the services and industry sectors have been more affected than the agricultural sector. You have here the service sector, which represents 54% of Rwanda economy, shrinking by 6.3%. This is the number we have for the first 3 quarters of the year 2020. The agricultural sector, the growth was neutral. But this is to be compared to the 5% growth that this sector, in fact, was enjoying during the last decade. Okay? Last message may be on this slide to see that within, in fact, the urban area, the poorest are the most affected. I'm talking here about the first quintile, in fact. These are the poorest, they are the most affected. Just an indication that those poor in informal sector, in fact, in the urban area, may be less resilient compared maybe to the civil servant and the salaries, in fact, the richest in the urban area. What about the long-term implication of this crisis? That also appears very clearly from Albert's presentation, that this crisis, the effect of this crisis, is not really temporary. What the graph you have here is giving us the loss of real household consumption in 2021, but also in 2025 and 2030. Couple of messages here. The first one, we can see that the loss of the consumption is permanent. So we're still having this loss, in fact, from 2021 to 2030. The second thing to see is that the loss is actually increasing. In fact, what is behind that increasing? The fact that it's increasing is just mean that the growth that we will be having in the post-COVID is not going to be the same level of the growth that was being anticipated before the crisis. So we are not going back very quickly, in fact, to our historical path of growth in Rwanda. That's what is shared, in fact, with this increasing trend of a loss in real consumption. But the question is why, in fact, why are we not going back quickly, in fact, to the historical path? Couple of reasons. First one is that as far as the tourism sector is concerned, it's very difficult to see a very quick recovery in that particular sector. Given that the pandemic is still very much here, we still have so many restrictions. In fact, this is something that Rwanda does not even control. In fact, so many restrictions in so many countries. The second factor is that this crisis is going to have a lasting impact on investment, because investors will need confidence to start reinvesting. The financial sector in Rwanda, even if that financial sector remains very sound, we notice that they are lending more money. In fact, new loans, in fact, actually decline substantially, and they are going to need time to gain confidence to start borrowing again, then giving money to the private sector again. So this one important factor. The last one is about the productivity. It's very likely that the productivity that we have after the crisis is going to be lower than what we used to have. Why? First reason, just the disruption that we are seeing in human capital, big driver of the productivity. And also the long-term separation that many of the workers have, with their activity. The longer you stay home, in fact, without exercising, the less productive, in fact, you are going to be the day you resume your activities. So one maybe last message on this slide is for us to notice that the household in the rural area seem to be less resilient in the long term. Why is that? The reason is just that even if the recovery in the services and the economy overall is slow, it's going to be even slower in the agricultural sector, because this historically has been, in fact, the lagging sector, in fact, in Rwanda. It's also the case in many countries. What about the poverty implication of this? The pandemic is likely to increase poverty rather sharply. What you have here, the two graphs that we have here are giving us the change in the poverty incidence due to the COVID in 2021. And we are seeing that the incidence of poverty, the percentage of the people, in fact, living under poverty, is likely going to increase by at least 5%. This represents more than 515,000 new poor. And among these, 85% of them are going to live in a rural area. You wonder why? Of course, in Rwanda, 82% of the population live in a rural area, and 92% of the poor in Rwanda also live in rural area. And in addition to that, we also know that most of the non-poor in rural area live just below the poverty line. So it doesn't take that much for them, in fact, to become poor. Let us now talk about the social and human capital effect of this crisis. Let's start with the health. So what we are seeing, in fact, in the health sector is a significant disruption in health services. However, this disruption seems temporary. The graph that we have here, in fact, are showing us very clearly, in fact, a reduction in the health facility visits. We are also seeing a reduction in the number of immunization of the children, but that was during the period of lockdown. We can also see in the graph, in fact, from the month of August at the end of the lockdown, that you have some catching up happening. So in the report, we agree that maybe when the most important threat, in fact, as far as help is concerned, will be through the channel of the reduction that we see in the consumption. Because this reduction of the consumption could impact the level of the nutrition. And if the nutrition is impacted, this can have important implications for the stunting and the long-term, medium-term productivity of the country. What about the education impact? The government of Rwanda reacted very quickly and very robustly, in fact, to implement remote learning in a way that was actually considered as one of the best performances within the continent. However, the fact that we had more than 3.5 million students out of school is going to have implications on learning loss. Given that some of the children, in fact, had difficulty accessing internet, computer, and having access to TV and radio. And our estimate is showing that the level of learning loss, in fact, could range, depending on the scenario that we have, that could range from 0.2 to 0.5 years of school loss. So because you are learning a year of, you have this learning loss, that is going to have implication on the wage and the employability of the student of today. And as a result of that, we are estimating that the student of today in their lifetime could face more than 10% of GDP to 30% of GDP of today in terms of earning loss. Now, let us talk about the response. So this is the second part of our presentation. And here, the Rwanda Economic Update covers the health response, but also the social and economic response. In terms of the health response, the main message here is that the strong governmental response saved lives. And this graph that you have here is really there to illustrate. So Rwanda has been qualified in international media as well as best practice in terms of handling this crisis. And that can be seen here where you have the number of cases per million population. Rwanda is doing very, very much better than most countries. Now, in terms of economic and social response, the economic recovery plan adopted by the government of Rwanda in April 2020 was one of the strongest within the region. The 900 million plans, in fact, which represent something like 4.4 GDP per year, because this is almost 2 years program. This is the strongest of the total of the EAC region, and the strongest even compared to the largest economy in the Africa, except the South Africa. Okay, this package does what? The package allows to expand in-kind assistance program, provide financial assistance to households, provide subsidized loans and credit guarantee to business in affected sectors, help protect access to health and primary education services, and also addressing some of the key infrastructure gaps. What about the impact of this economic and social response? It's still too early, in fact, for us to really make a judgment on this. However, one aspect we were able to assess in this report is the social safety net, social protection response. And we can see that deployment, the extensive social safety net that was deployed in Rwanda really made a difference. Our simulation is indicating that expansion of social safety net led to 1.4 percentage point reduction in poverty in 2020. So all this was made possible by very strong at central level, very strong administrative at central level, but also at local government level. Let me talk about the last part of our presentation, which is the way forward. And here, in fact, the purpose is really to ask ourselves what should be done to protect and promote human capital in Rwanda, the post-COVID area. How to protect and promote human capital. So exceptional measures are really required here for this to happen, for this protection to happen. The Rwanda Economic Update identified 3 main dimensions of intervention. The first one is saving lives. The second one are the measure to protect the poor and the most vulnerable. The third one, in fact, are the reform, policy, investment measure to help the country to building back better. So I'm going to start with the first policy area, which is saving lives. Here in the short term, what we are seeing as really obvious and what the Minister of Health also just said, vaccine deployment is the top priority, and the equitable deployment of vaccine will be a true game changer. So for this, the government, in fact, will need, through his national vaccination plan, in fact, to continue his effort to develop clear criteria for who will be prioritized for vaccine, provide training and technical assistance for those who will be in charge of the vaccine, and prepare also for risk communication and community engagement. The second priority, in fact, in the short term, is just for the government to continue, in fact, the extraordinary effort that has already been in place to protect the delivery of essential health and nutrition service. This is really crucial, in fact, to mitigate the risk of losing decades of progress made in this area. So in the medium term, to save life, investing in the preparedness and health security, which something the minister also pointed out, is going to be crucial. Rwanda also made tremendous progress here. However, there's still some gaps. In fact, as we can see, Rwanda ranked 117 out of 195 countries on the Global Health Security Index. So to strengthen the country readiness level, it really will be critical, and something that the minister mentioned, to fully finance and effectively implement the National Action Plan for Health Security. So this will have to be done in a sustainable way. And for us, doing this in a sustainable way will mean really try to rely on domestic resources and only leverage on donor and private sector support. Let us talk about the second area of policy recommendation here, which is how to protect the poor and the most vulnerable. The first and most important thing to do here is really to strengthen the already very good social safety net in Rwanda. How to do this? First thing, increase the overall coverage of social safety net. Doing that by further expanding the coverage of UP, which is the government flagship social protection program. This should be done with special focus on the human capital for sensitive programs. For example, I'm thinking about the social protection program that are related to nutrition and social protection program that are related to disability. So this will have an important impact on protecting, in terms of protecting the human capital. Lastly, it will be important for poverty reduction purpose to also expand the social insurance to the informal sector where most of the poor in the country operate. Also, to strengthen the social safety net, it will be very important, something that has already been said, to really work to improve the targeting system. If we do this, that will increase, in fact, the cost effectiveness of the program. So we have one example here, the example of the community-based program of Obudehe Category 1. So Obudehe Category 1 at this moment, in fact, is covering among his beneficiaries, you have 46%, in fact, of them are poor. However, if a more objective targeting system like the one relying on household welfare scorecard were to be adopted, this targeting of the poor could increase from 46% to 73%.
Calvin, can you get closer to the microphone? I mean, some of us are losing you. Oh. And hello, I guess we all get off our cameras and see whether we can get the audio there.
But the learning law have recovered that is not harmful the vulnerable vulnerable
Oh, looks like we've lost Calvin and most people. Hello? Hello, Calvin? Looks like we have lost Calvin. Alice, can you hear me from where you're seated? Can somebody hear me?
Yes,
I can hear you, Roger.
I think we'll have to move to the next item. We lost Calvin and the sound was not very good. Let us just have, move to the next item and see whether we'll fare any better. But, thank you. Thanks so much for Calvin. Presentation. He's made a very good presentation. Unfortunately, we were just interrupted by the network. But until it happened, you agree with me that the presentation was very well done and very passionately presented, and it's very rich presentation and full of very interesting information. Before oh, Calvin, you're back?
No, hi Rogers, this is Roland. I've spoken with Calvin who's trying to reconnect. And I think he's on his way. So if we could give him 2 minutes, or perhaps we could move to the next thing, which would be the short video. See if that gives him an opportunity to reconnect. And if he does, then we will go back to his presentation. If not, we will move on with the panel. How is that?
I think that is very good. Let us just move to the video, and then while Calvin is organizing himself, and then we'll come back to him to have the remaining part of the presentation.
Yes, I think the thunderstorm could be giving us a hard time, but let's move to that.
Okay, so we're moving to the next item, just a 3 or 4 minutes video, which is somehow a kind of a recap of what the presentation Calvin has just been making, continue making. But before we move to that, I would like just to call upon our participants out there. Please join the discussion using the hashtag Rwanda Economic Update. Rwanda Economic Update, one word. Please join the discussion using that hashtag. So let us see whether the technical team can put the video up for us. Thanks. I hope you have enjoyed that small clip. Calvin, are you back?
I'm back. If I can share my screen, I will. Okay. Can I share the presentation?
Yes, please go ahead, Calvin.
Yeah, so I'm waiting for the IT to allow me to share the presentation. John, am I able to share it? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to be able to share. Yes, I'm sorry for this issue. If you can hear me now, I will go ahead and finish the presentation.
We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you. I can hear you clearly.
Yeah, so I believe I was caught when I was already on the last part of the presentation, which was the policy area 3, how to strengthen the policies and institutions, as well as investment for building back better. So we explain a little bit what this will mean for Rwanda, having higher growth, more inclusive growth, more sustainable growth, building on bigger role of the private sector, also building on the other major growth engine, which is the productivity supported by strong human capital. So very concretely, in fact, what does this mean? In fact, the very first measure here to really have human capital that support this is to make sure that we have resources for it. So we have resources for it by creating the fiscal space needed. That will happen if we are able to control the debt. Unfortunately, with the crisis, Rwanda public debt rose, in fact, from 58% in 2019 to almost 65%, more than 65% in 2020, and it's being projected now to reach 71%. So it's very clear that in the short term, the government need an expansionary fiscal policy to mitigate the effect of the crisis. However, in the medium term, it's going to be really essential to think about the fiscal sustainability. This, in fact, through some of the measures that has been already discussed here, better domestic revenue mobilization, starting by removing progressively and at the appropriate moment some of the tax exception that has been introduced to mitigate the effect of the current crisis. But that will also, in fact, go through that overall medium-term strategy of revenue mobilization that the government put in place with the IMF, and that is having some of very promising results. Secondly, in fact, to really strengthen the fiscal sustainability, the debt management, fiscal transparency is going to be key. So the government, in fact, will need to do what it's doing already, to do even just more, adopting some of the best practices in terms of fiscal transparency, publishing more fiscal statements, conducting more fiscal risk assessment, including, for example, SOEs and PPPs. The second area of policy to build back better, in fact, is just for the country to make sure that we are training, in fact, the critical skills that are needed for the growth of tomorrow, for the future growth. So step for doing this, in fact, to make sure that we are improving digital skills for faculties and students, particularly for youth, including those who are out of school, and also with a particular focus on the young female. It's also going to be important to support the tertiary education and help them to increase the training of healthcare professionals, including doing this, in fact, in high-tech skills. That will be very important. The other area, in fact, will be to strengthen the education system with greater capacity. How to do this? This is done by ensuring some accountability for learning outcome. This is done by ensuring that the formation of quality education leader is being made. This is also done, in fact, by improving the link between the education system and the economic priorities, and particularly the private sector needs. So finally, building back better would mean that the government trying to put in place some of the key complementary infrastructure that help really the human capital. Starting with what the chief economists also say, in fact, the energy, access to electricity is going to be capital. Access to greater high-speed internet is going to be also key, not just to help, in fact, the kids have to have efficient remote learning, but also to reduce some of the inequality in access to better education tools that we have in fact. So if access to internet is cheap, is accessible and cheap, everyone will be able to access, and the good education tools will be accessible to all. Finally, and more broadly, increasing access to broadband internet will be critical to accelerate, in fact, structural transition to a more productive and modern economy. Thank you so much, and sorry, in fact, for small incidents, and thank you for joining. These are just some of the message of the report. The report is going to be available on the World Bank website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Calvin. Like I said earlier, this is a very interesting, presentation, and I'm sure many people are going to enjoy the report when they just read it and then carry with what you have just presented in. Our next item and last item and the last this evening is a panel discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce to you some of the all the presenters or the panelists. In no particular order, I would like to welcome the Honorable Professor Shaka Anastase, Minister of Local Government, Honorable Twagirayezu Gaspar, State Minister for Primary Education and Secondary Education, the Minister of Education, Madam Amina Rwankunda, Chief Economist, and Dr. Albert Chief Economist for Africa Region, who will also join the panel. This session will be moderated by my colleague Anne Bakilana. Madam Anne Bakilana is a World Bank Program Leader for Human Development, overseeing education, health, and social protection program and portfolio program in Kenya, Rwanda, Somalia, and Uganda, and is based in Nairobi. It's my pleasure to call upon her to moderate this particular session. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rogers. Thank you very much. And good afternoon and good morning to all participants that are joining this launch of the Rwanda Economic Update. And thank you again to our distinguished panel that is joining us for this session. For the next 40 to 45 minutes or so, we'll be digging a bit deeper into the implications of the pandemic on human development, on fiscal space, etc. And given that the projections show that the implications of the pandemic would be long-lasting, we look forward to hearing how the government of Rwanda has responded, how it plans to continue responding. And since most countries globally are facing similar challenges and trying to put in place the right policies, we will hear examples of international experiences as to how other countries are responding to the pandemic. To get us started, I'll go first to Honorable Minister Shiaka, who has oversight on social protection in Rwanda. Minister Shiaka, as is the case globally, the Rwanda Economic Update posits that the economic impact of the pandemic has dire implications for welfare, with significant implications for increasing levels of poverty. Maybe to kick off the discussion, can you share with us how Rwanda's social safety net is performing in mitigating the effects of COVID-19 on vulnerable? And as a follow-up question, since research shows that women experience worse impacts from the effects of the pandemic, please share with us if there has been any targeted support to women. Over to you, Minister Shiaka.
Thank you very much, our moderator, honorable ministers, the World Bank country manager, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. First and foremost, I want to thank the organizers for this event, to not only to organize this, but also to associate us but most importantly, to focus this year's or the current Rwanda economic update on this important issue globally, not only for Rwanda, but I think even globally. COVID has become an animal that we can't forget to see if you are working around the world. And second, I would appreciate, I want to appreciate the assessment of the impact of COVID with a focus on human capital. As we all know, human capital is very essential for any transformation agenda to take shape. And more specifically for Rwanda, we have been focusing on human capital development in the last few years to make sure that we can have spillover effects on other developmental agenda that we are undertaking. So I wanted just to recognize this. And coming back to your question, my sister, Rwanda, of course, is not an exception. No, COVID has been hitting all around, across the continent and beyond. And there is no single country in the world which hasn't up to date felt its effect. And from the report as it has been shared, and as we know, the pandemic has multidimensional effects. There are effects in the health sector, there are effects in the economy, there are also other associated to those two effects. So if we look at Rwanda and more specifically at our safety nets, coming to your question, first and foremost, we wanted to appreciate also the World Bank to be one of our very key partners in the designing and driving and supporting our social protection programs. They have been very impactful. They have contributed to the rapid poverty reduction that we have seen and the whole world has been seeing in Rwanda. Whatever portion of the years you take, you will see safety net programs have been have played a catalytic role in reducing poverty and stimulating development. So I wanted also to signalize that. And more specifically, when we get closer to this period where we are facing the pandemic, that means 2021, but also starting in 2020, we have been hit by, how do I put this? So I want, because I saw the report showing diversity of economic impact that African countries, or maybe I will come to that later on, comparing African countries with some having very heavy economic impacts compared to others. So I think we need a bit of that analysis so that we understand. But in the context of Rwanda, we've been looking at health impact, protecting lives, as the report actually is putting it, but also supporting that with not allowing the economy to collapse, keeping that one also in mind. And that's how we have been evolving. And our social safety nets have also worked in that spirit. Remember when we confronted the COVID, we had to revisit our delivery systems of social protection programs to ensure that we impact on timeliness, that fix where we used to have programs that are delivered, yes, but with some delays, to make a U-turn on that element that we controlled, and it worked. And within the VUP, the Village Division Umurenge program, the VUP, sub-components, we have direct support, we have public works, we have financial services, but more specifically on public works and direct support, we've moved to that timeliness rate from 50 and 60% to above 90. So all our component of the VUP in terms of timeliness, 91% and above. That's the current timeliness rate we have achieved. And that achievement has come as COVID was unfolding. So, and that requested our systems to be dynamic and agile enough to adapt and to fix that important aspect we wanted to achieve. But also, there is another element that we included in our agenda was, since the pandemic was hitting across the country, no a single district as we speak has been safe from it. So we wanted to make sure that our targeting can go up to all our districts and all our sectors of those in the implementation of those safety nets. And we achieved it to a greater extent with some programs as we speak, for instance, all direct support programs, they do reach all our 416 sectors and 30 districts. For the public works, we haven't yet reached that level, but we have increased at least by about 30% of what we were meeting. Roughly, I think we are reaching 240, and now we have added about 80 more sectors, which is an ambition to reach very soon the 416 again, as we are now around 320, 330. So that's the short-term immediate response around the social protection programs that we deployed. And more specifically for the timeliness of the direct support inputs, that one we have actually combined the governance perspectives with the technology elements, where we have started the digitalization, at least the partial digitalization of those programs, where at our end and at the end of the people, what is remaining and we are fixing is the one related to SACO, digitalization. But other parts have been digitalized, which has contributed to the high performance in terms of timeliness that I was sharing with you. So when we look at the social protection programs and what we have, the other very important aspect that we might point to at this juncture is that when we faced the pandemic, we were struggling with the health aspect and we started looking at the economy. As part of our government comprehensive program called Economic Recovery Plan, one of its components was on social protection and relief responses. And that has helped us to align both the economic recovery with relief response and also with other accompanying measures, as all these contained in the economic recovery. But what the government of Rwanda economic recovery tells us is that whenever we look at the economic progress, we tie to it the poverty alleviation and poverty reduction and safety net programs to ensure that, or to make sure that whatever gains in economy we get, we are also having gains in the society, if I can put that way. The other point I wanted to talk about is the relief response included also. I think Minister for Health has alluded on it, has talked about the lockdowns, the social distancing, and all those measures. So you can imagine the city of Kigali or wherever it is, if you put people under a 2-3 weeks lockdown, not everyone has in a bank account $2,000 she can use to feed their own families. So it was imperative for us that as much as we want to protect lives and we want to impose lockdown, or we want to stop some services to operate to ensure that the pandemic is not spreading, it was absolutely imperative that we don't take that one only alone as our government strategy. So our strategy has been, what are the other elements that we bring in so that we contain the side effect of the measures in the social and economic landscape. So that's why whenever we locked down, whether we total lock down the city of Kigali, or we have, because we used also to have some localized lockdown where you lock just a small village. But indeed, if you lock down a village, you will also need some accompanying measures to make sure that you don't prevent COVID, people to die from COVID, and then they are heavily, severely affected by the hunger or otherwise. So we had that system of food distribution in the case of lockdown, whether it is the total city of Kigali we locked down, which we did twice, and whether it was the small localized lockdowns towards villages, towards cells, or towards other entities that are smaller. So, and it worked. So I will just use the Kigali lockdowns because of their significance. They were big enough, and they are hitting in a city where a big portion of our communities is in informal sector. That's number one. Number two, there are a big portion of those in informal sector who can afford to eat after work, when they have worked. So if they are under lockdown, there is no work, and the immediate consequence will be there is no food and no feeding of the families, which we prevented with our food distribution strategy for the city of Kigali, which we last year we distributed, we supported. It was a 6 weeks long lockdown, and we distributed, we supported slightly above 210 households. 210. If you take one household is about 4 people, so you will basically find that it was way above 50% of the people living in Kigali. Suppose you get to 800 people, we assume Kigali has about 1.2, 1.3 or 5 people living in the city. So, and for this month and the previous one, the last 3 weeks that we have had lockdown in Kigali, we have supported, or we have provided foodstuff support to about 150 households, which will give you roughly above 500,000 individuals, close to 600, because the family size is usually mainly 3, 4, 5 people, but you have some families with 6, 7 members and above, and others very few with 1 or 2 family members. So that's the landscape of how we have supported our people. And the second question you've asked with regard to women, there are things that are very clear. So when you talk about informal sector and you focus on informal sector without any other mathematics, you know that you have targeted women, because women, that sector is known to be to have a lot of women operating in it. Look into the small trade, commerce, people working in markets, having some small shops, trying to do some trading, cross-border trade. Sometimes we have also had to shut down and lock down them. So women have been targeted. But secondly, there is a specific initiative we undertook to specifically target women and women with limited capacities. That is to strengthen their households' livelihoods, and we worked with both some NGOs, but also with the Rwanda, our agency implementing the social protection programs. And that in that specific women targeted approach, we targeted women in the city of Kigali and in other major cities in Rwanda. So, and we targeted, I think it should around 35,000, if not more, in cash transfers. So that was done to spur that, to ensure that the women operating in that category, in that informal sector, can flourish, can be, can develop faster, and it has worked. So maybe as an introduction, if I can stop there, but if I can also say something about...
Thank you, Professor Shaka. Maybe I'll give you an opportunity further down the line to give us further examples of how you have responded. I think, what you have mentioned is actually quite impressive in terms of how the government has been able to mount such an effective response, looking at the most vulnerable and actually considering the coordination that is needed between the various key players in order to support the population, not only for the impact on health, but actually looking at the vulnerabilities that the populations would face when other measures, including the lockdowns, were being rolled out. And maybe just to bring in at this point another sector that has been very severely affected, I want to bring in Honorable Minister Twagirayezu, who is Rwanda's Minister of State in charge of primary and secondary education. Honorable Minister Twagirayezu, the pandemic actually has had a devastating impact on the education sector, not only globally, but as the numbers show, this has been the case for Rwanda, and with the potential for maybe some of these impacts being long-lasting. But when the pandemic actually began, the government of Rwanda was already engaged in significant reforms in the education sector. And these reforms were aiming to improve learning outcomes, and you were already working on significantly increasing the number of classrooms and improving the quality of instruction. Maybe you can share with us, given that what we've heard so far is that the impact on education is actually going to be, hardly very much felt in Rwanda. Maybe you can share with us how the COVID pandemic, those reforms, and have you had to change course or introduce new approaches in terms of the reforms that you were planning? Over to you, Honorable Minister Twagirayezu.
Thank you very much, Anne. And before I begin, I would just want to also thank the World Bank for putting together this report and this event. So as you just said, the education sector has been severely hit by COVID-19, and this is not only in Rwanda, but also globally. In Rwanda, we have had our more than 3.5 million children out of school for March of 2020 because schools were closed in March. And the reopening process started in October in phases. And the last batch of children, the low and the pre-primary, went back to school in January of this year. So which means the reopening process is pretty much complete, even if all the learners are not back to school yet, because now Kigali has been under lockdown, and schools are going to be closed for the next few weeks in Kigali. So this closure has impacted, as you said, and also as it is in this report, has impacted learners, and we are at risk of losing some of the gains that we have registered over the years. And there are very big lessons that we have learned during this COVID-19. And this is something that we are going to build on and to make sure that we build a more resilient system going forward. So if I may, I am going to talk quickly about some of the things that we have been doing when the learners were not in school. So when we closed schools in March, we started implementing a remote learning program. We were very aggressive at that. We tried all the methods that were available to us, including television, radio, internet, cell phones. And this was on lesson delivery, where we had recorded lessons, but also on feedback of learners, because this is something that we thought was very important to make sure that we have feedback from the learners. This is why we used SMS, where students could go on use phones and check answer some questions, and also be able to talk to some of the people that we had put in place to assist. But as you may imagine, this has not reached everyone. So which is actually what we are talking about here, this divide. So we have seen that there is a large number of learners, and this is also in the report, that were not able to access either of those methods. And we have seen that at different levels across the country. We have some areas, of course, that had a larger uptake than others, but also across levels. If you compare the students in the primary, surprisingly, they have a higher interaction with those. But those in the secondary schools, so we may imagine that some of them maybe were doing things other than learning. But we have seen that it's remote learning is very good. It's a very good thing, and we are going to keep investing in it. But we have seen that it's not access is not equal to those methods. So which actually gives us one of the things that I would want to talk about and what we are doing to make sure that we build a more resilient system. And this is investing in technology. So this is something that we have seen that we need to invest in technology, because technology is a must now. When we are starting this conversation, you talked about how we try to increase the number of classrooms, and this is something that we have done over the lockdown, and we have built around more than 22,000 classrooms, and this was to make sure that we eliminate double shifting, but also to make sure that we have enough space for learners. But this exercise was not conceived in the context of COVID-19. It was not only conceived to combat the effects of COVID-19, but it was also part of the larger effort of the government of Rwanda to improve quality of education. But we are seeing that those numbers of classrooms, some of them have been completed, and they are actually being very helpful in this period where we want to make sure that learners are not the school classrooms are not congested. So, but as much as we can have that infrastructure, we also need to make sure that once the learners go there, once they go there, that they get a meaningful experience. So this is why we are investing in technology, and to make sure that we have a blended learning process that's inclusive, but that's also accessible to as many learners as possible. So one is technology. And the second part is also to make sure that all learners go back to school. So because this is also something that we are seeing, we have reopened all the grades, but there is still a significant percentage of learners who are not back to school. And we made sure that in our going back to school process, we include a campaign. We call it the Back to School campaign. where we work with local leaders, and we go even to the level of door to door to make sure that if a family has learners, they make sure that they know that schools are open and that the learners are supposed to go back to school. But this is not enough. The information itself is not enough. We also try to go deeper and try to analyze why these kids are not going back to school. So, which is why in our COVID-19 response plan for education sector, we also made sure that we include some level of assistance for students who are vulnerable and who can maybe not afford some scholastic materials, and we made sure that we have some level of support, even if it doesn't reach everyone, but we made sure that that level of support is there. And another thing that we are very much focusing on is capacity of teachers, because we believe that we all know that the teachers are the backbone of our education system, and we have to make sure that we increase their capacity. So, when we were building those classrooms, I mean, it's very automatic that if you build in the classrooms, you also need to hire teachers. So, over the last months, last year, we have actually we are starting that process in Rwanda to add more than 24,000 teachers in both primary and secondary schools. So, and we have placed a large number of those teachers. So, this is a very large number, and we already had another significant number of teachers in our schools. So, but now that we have those teachers in place, we need to make sure that we work on their capacity. And this teacher capacity development actually starts even before they go to school. So this is why we are also strengthening pre-service services for teachers. And in Rwanda, we pay 50% of tuition fees for everyone who goes to teacher training colleges. And this is to make sure that we have large numbers of qualified students who go into that profession. And we are also adopting a teacher-first policy when it comes to technology in schools. So we want to make sure that the teachers, if we are going to use technology in a certain school, we want to make sure that the teachers have access to technology and access to that capacity. That's going to help them not only know how to use technology, but know how to teach using technology. This is something also we are building on. And we are also trying to make sure that the teachers have the right materials that they use. We want to make sure that they have the right teaching guides, and to make sure that they know what we want from them, but also to help them be able to deliver on their mission. But something I would also want to talk about teachers is we want to listen to the teachers. This is something that we cannot do too much of. We want to make sure that we listen to the teachers and check on them and see how they are doing and what challenges they have, and to make sure that we solve those. And the last thing that I want to mention is that we're all working on strengthening our education governance. And this is to make sure that we have a system that's responsive enough to make sure that if we have challenges like the ones we have now, we are able to collaborate across the board and make sure that we tackle some of those challenges. So we want to make sure that we strengthen downstream governance structures for education, but also we want to make sure that we link some of the responsibilities that these governance structures have to learning outcomes. I think Roland said this in our opening remarks. We want to make sure that we do not focus too much on inputs, but rather on what those inputs do to make sure that we have quality outcomes from for these kids. So I think I'm going to stop here, and maybe we have a chance to discuss more down the line. Thank you very much.
Maybe just one thing, Honorable Togireyezu, before you go. I might not get an opportunity to ask you another question on this, but you've mentioned quite a number of really excellent initiatives that the government of Rwanda is rolling out and had intended to roll out even before the pandemic hit, including using more digital methodologies in teaching for the students, but also for the teachers. But in the context where you do have that digital divide, where access to internet is not as equally distributed, what are you doing in the education sector to ensure that every child actually has access to some of these digital methods of teaching, has access to materials in cases where there is no electricity? What's the plan of the government to ensure that every child has access?
Thank you very much. That's actually a very good question, but also a very difficult one to answer. But during when schools were students were at home, we tried as much as possible to provide devices to different families that did not have access to them. And this included different radio receivers so that students can follow some of the lessons that were there. But I think also some of the other interventions go even beyond the education sector itself. So this is where actually collaboration and coordination across the different sectors is going to come in handy. You talked about electricity, so we need to make sure that Rwanda actually has a program to make sure that as many people as possible have access to electricity, and this is going to directly benefit some of the learners too. But also, as education sector, we are trying to also increase access to devices, including computers and phones, but also to try to make sure that we build mechanisms to make sure that students can have access to those resources even when they are not at school. And this is something that we have seen was a bit of a problem during when students were not at school, because we would have devices at school, but they were not being used because the learners were at home. So we want now to have a clear mechanism in place to make sure that students and teachers can have access to those resources even when they are at home. But also for learning to be for remote learning to be effective, these learners also need help, right? So it's one thing for them to have access to a computer, but if they are at home alone and they don't have anyone else to help them, and then that's not going to be very useful. So, and this is, we have seen that there's this school and home environment, that gap is getting narrower and narrower now, right? So, and we need to make sure that, and this is, I think, a long-term solution, we need to make sure that we also invest in educating the society at large, right? So, because now we have that the role of teacher now, I mean, we have teachers in schools, but also parents, we are asking them to be teachers, right? So all the siblings are now asked to be teachers. So we need to make sure that they have enough information, but you also need to make sure that they have actually that ability to help these learners at home. So this is where other programs like the Ministry of ICT's plan to increase digital literacy even among the population also comes in handy, because we want to make sure that when students are at home, they can be helped. But all of these strategies, they cannot work if there is not enough devices. So, and this is why we are trying as much as possible, and with the help of different partners like the World Bank has been helping and others, we want to make sure that we increase that access to devices and quality content. We want to increase the education sector's ability to have to produce our own content, but also to curate good content from all over, and to make sure that the students, it's packaged in a more friendly way so that the students can access it. So there is no easy
Thank you, Honorable
answer to your
Minister.
question, but we are trying as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Certainly one of the biggest challenges that most countries are facing in the education sector, which is how to reduce the inequality in terms of access, but also outcomes. So let me move quickly to Madam Chief Economist, Minekofin, Mrs. Rwanda. We heard in the presentations from Dr. Zofak, from our colleague Calvin, on what the impact has been on the economy of Rwanda. So maybe you could give us, and we also heard that the government of Rwanda was very quick to implement and to roll out the economic recovery plan when the pandemic hit. So maybe you could give us a frank assessment of the implementation of the economic recovery plan, and in summary, what would you say has been the success of that plan? And maybe some of the key constraints in its implementation. Maybe if you could briefly share that with us. Thanks. Over to you, Mrs. Rwanda.
Thank you very much, Anna, and it's always a pleasure for me to be part of this excellent report. We always work with the World Bank team in providing information, conducting discussion, but also comment on the report. So we are always excited when we are seeing the report out with an excellent analysis, and this time even COVID is actually bringing out a lot of important information. So to have a frank assessment of the economic recovery plan after 8 months of implementation, and Kevin was saying that it's too early maybe to assess the impact of the response, but we can still look at some of the key economic indicators in 2020, just to get the flavor of the impact. The first one is the indicator on unemployment rate that increased during the early days of the pandemic from 13.1% in Q1 2020 to 22.1% with the first lockdown that was induced to stop the spread of the virus. And later the rate fell to 16% in August 2020. And between February and August 2020, sectors like construction, telecommunication recorded an increase of more than 80% in numbers of employed persons, and it was 53% for manufacturing. And actually, those numbers were actually more than what were registered, recorded in August 2019. So the recovery in employment was possible with the government policy of fast-tracking and initiating key infrastructure and mining projects that could actually create more jobs. And it was also possible with the support package to businesses in terms of loan restructuring, working capital, tax breaks, that has helped them to some extent to navigate the challenges of the pandemic and be able to protect and recover some jobs. So talking of the support to private sector, this is the first time actually the government is extending its balance sheet with an economic recovery fund of more than $200 million to support private sector activities to recover from the pandemic. We have already $100 million US dollar that has been deployed, providing working capital, loan refinancing, guarantee, and soon we are going to launch an investment and a support to investment with additional financing that we are mobilizing actually together with World Bank. So on the monetary policy side is to know that liquidity support to the financial sector and loan restructuring have provided relief and real support to private sector to actually bring back the dynamic necessary for economic rebound. Well, one number to look at is the non-performing loans. So instead of piling up, actually reduced in 2020. Other measures such as trade, export facilitation measures are also being implemented, and we've seen total turnovers of industry sector and services sector together increasing by 1.1% in nominal terms. If you compare 2020 and 2019, and for industry sector, it was actually strong at around 21.6%. As for GDP growth, most sectors that were less concerned by the drop in external demand and by domestic restriction were able to recover and to post a positive growth in Q3 2020. Those sectors are manufacturing with 6%, general trade, wholesale and trade, food crop at 2%. So the last indicator is the inflation rate, which the pandemic, along with the associated lockdown, mobility restriction, physical distancing in public transport, has led to a pickup in prices of from 3.3% in December 2019 to 7.3% already in January 2020, and later to 9.2% in July 2020, and remain actually within that range until October 2020. So the main drivers were a disappointing agricultural growth at the beginning of the year 2020, and an increase in public transport fare of more than 40%. So government actually had to respond to those issues by implementing policy measures such as to apply a pre-COVID tariff in public transport, beginning of actually toward the end of October 2020, by providing support package to public transport operators. On agriculture, the policy to increase agriculture production, on-time input distribution to farmers, to make actually input affordable, and we've seen a reduction in price per kilo by 60% for seed, 20% for fertilizer. The increase in area cultivated, etc., have resulted into a better performance of the agriculture sector in the second half of the year 2020. And as a result, we've seen actually inflation, coming down to 4.2% in November and 3.7% in December 2020. So without those those interventions by the government, it will have accelerated actually the weight or the burdens on household, and it will have depressed even further consumption. So on the social response, I'm not going to repeat what Honorable Minister of Local Government actually mentioned, but I have another area where we are seeing tremendous achievement is on digital adoption with the shock of COVID. So we are seeing, for example, number of subscribers for mobile banking increasing by 172%. And here I'm comparing 3 quarters of 2020 with actually the entire year of 2019. And for internet banking, we have an increase, already an increase of 92%. Again, with only 9 months of 2020. And if you look at mobile payment, we have more than 200 increase in the number of active subscribers. Even the number of mobile agents increased by 242. So on constraint to the implementation of the economic recovery plan, I think the biggest constraint is related to the nature of this crisis. So there's no reference case for the COVID-19 crisis. We have to learn how to come up with a response how to address the shock. Therefore, the level of uncertainty has made it difficult to actually implement plans and to even make robust assumptions on the path forward. And this is true for businesses and consumers in all economies across the globe, because the level of uncertainty just makes decision to invest or to consume harder. And consequently, some of the government policies in the economic recovery plan have been actually subdued by the lack of risk appetite by businesses and lack of consumer confidence. So if we have to talk recovery of the economy, we have to boost confidence of investors and consumers. So another aspect that is very challenging for the government in responding to the pandemic is that, how to put it, you can fight the virus, but you can't keep the economy intact and undamaged. So meaning that every time COVID restriction measures are enforced and a lockdown is introduced, there will be almost a return to square one in some of the progress made, and it will also bring precarious socio-economic conditions that will be aggravated. So the last one, but not the least, is competing demand for resources in the budget for the implementation of the economic recovery plan, because government resources fell due to COVID-19 shock, while COVID-related expenditures increased. And this crisis found us with a limited fiscal space that cannot actually accommodate a robust fiscal response, which is necessary for strong recovery. So therefore, a greater international community support in terms of liquidity, financial assistance, debt relief that we mentioned in the Calvin presentation, and also the Chief Economic Officer also mentioned it, is urgently needed for developing countries, including Rwanda, for the implementation of our economic recovery plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rakunda, Madam Chief Economist. Maybe I can, and thank you very much for really, highlighting the delicate balance that must be met between, saving lives and measures that aim to protect lives, while at the same time trying to make sure that those measures do not depress consumption any further. And thanks for sharing very much the range of programs that have been put in place to support the private sector, to keep the economy going, and making sure that the economy is supported during the recovery period. Maybe I'll go to Dr. Zeofak, World Bank Africa Region Chief Economist. If you could, maybe share with us what you think Rwanda really must do to deal with the ever-shrinking fiscal space. What would you recommend in these current times as the essential pillars of the fiscal policy for Rwanda going forward? And maybe in your response, you could also suggest how Rwanda positions itself for a resilient, sustainable, and inclusive recovery over the medium term, given that we know that even with the rollout of vaccines, it's going to take some time before the major pillar of Rwanda's economy comes back into full force. So maybe you could share with us, including some of the experiences that we are seeing from other countries. Over to you, Albert.
Thank you very much, and really a great discussion. And thank you to Your Excellencies for addressing some of these issues already. I mean, it's crucial to avail that fiscal space to stage a good policy response and to really launch economic recovery. So in terms of creating that fiscal space, I think there are three important things to say. One is we need, a domestic response, which is all the discussion we have had so far on domestic revenue mobilization, and I'll come back to that. The second is we need external support, and this should come from the debt side and the debt relief that African countries need, because this is a global crisis, and the magnitude of the crisis is just so sharp that no country alone can really manage to get out of this terrible situation. And the third is we need to focus on long-term growth, because ultimately growth is what would actually allow us to raise those revenues. So let me elaborate a little bit more here. On the domestic revenue mobilization side, I think it's important to look at both revenue and expenditure. On the revenue side, it's quite tempting to just go towards a broadening of the tax base when there is a crisis. But again, here we need to be careful. There are some trade-offs. I see a number of African countries actually, reaching out and taxing all the electronic transactions as a way to raise more revenue. That may be short-sighted, because if the digital is, as we can agree, the digital is going to be, the lightning rod that we see out of this crisis, then we cannot curtail innovation, we cannot stifle innovation, and we cannot limit access with, making access to the digital already, that is already expensive, even more expensive. So we need to think in terms of trade-off when it comes to broadening the tax base. And again, the greatest way to raise revenues would be to, leverage the digital to, launch into areas of the fiscal, of the tax base that we haven't touched that much in most African countries. Again, land and property taxation is one area where we can clearly focus on, and the digital can help. On the revenue side, again, I think, a point we haven't been discussing so much is how to manage commodity revenues more transparently. In most African countries, most of the revenues come from exporting oil or minerals, or, and this is an area where, revenue management is not always that transparent or that efficient. That would actually be a good way to avail, to get some efficiency to, to avail the resources to invest, for example, in human capital. And broadly, improving transparency, and stemming financial, illicit financial flows could avail resources within countries to actually, start building up that fiscal space. On the expenditure side, it is clear that we need to streamline and reprioritize some of the spending. And most importantly, we need to rethink our investment program, public investment programs, and increase the efficiency of our investment programs. We need to make sure that, given the shrinking space, that the only investment that is really undertaken is one that is efficient enough to be able to pay back to service itself in the next foreseeable future. So it is extremely important. The other aspect where African countries can avail some fiscal space is a better management of public enterprises. The state-owned enterprises across Africa are a fiscal sink. And we cannot continue, for example, to have utilities, public utilities in the energy area, for example, that never recover cost. And very few countries in Africa actually have utilities that recover cost. And most of it is due to the energy mix, for sure, some countries producing electricity by burning very expensive fuel, but it's also in terms of operational gains, operational efficiency gains that can actually, limit the Ministry of Finance need to actually, sign a check for those utilities every month. So that's, again, areas that could be, done and applicable to Rwanda as well. Now, on the debt side, to close, on the debt side, I think it's crucial that collectively as African countries and the African Union, the President Kagame, President Ramaphosa, and others have been really fighting for Africa to have a voice in these discussions on the debt front. The G20 has come up with a common framework, but it's important for Africa to have its own voice. It's important for Africa to make sure we get a net positive flows out of the discussion, not just kick the can down the road, which is what the DSSI is, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, is just, delaying the problem, and the problem may actually grow bigger down the road. So ensuring that we get a net reduction in the volume of our debt is going to be a difficult discussion, but Africa as a group can actually achieve more results than just a single government. So that's going to be extremely important. But key to this is going to be improving debt transparency. My colleagues and I have written a paper that clearly show that if we could improve access to data and the transparency on data, including on debt data, including transparency on how we actually engage, how we contract debt, we may be able to save a lot of money from lower interest on our debt, especially when we issue Eurobonds. We've shown that countries that have higher level of debt transparency have lower spread on their issuances. So that would actually be a good way to save money, and it would be important to ensure debt transparency, not because we are being told, but because it's actually good for us. It's going to be a good way to actually reinforce that fiscal space that we need. It's going to get us some savings. So the role of the international community is going to be huge, but Africa as a group, Africa as a community can actually get more out of it. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albert, for an excellent response to where Rwanda, as well as other countries, could go in terms of making sure they have the fiscal space to be able to respond to this pandemic, but also beyond the pandemic. Since we have really run out of time, this has been really an excellent discussion. And I want to go back and thank the panel. I want to thank Honorable Minister Shiaka for sharing with us the experience from the safety net programs that Rwanda has strengthened in order to support the population during the pandemic. I want to really thank Honorable Minister Twagirayezu for sharing the experiences from the education sector, and really couldn't agree more in terms of the challenges that Rwanda will face in terms of ensuring that children go back to school and that learning outcomes continue to improve. I also want to thank Mrs. Rwakunda, Madam Chief Economist, Minecofin, for really sharing with us a wide range of programs that we have put in place in order to sustain consumption. And then to my colleague, Dr. Zeufa, thank you very much for sharing with us the experience from other countries, really helping us digest the numbers behind the presentations that were made, and really for helping us think carefully on what countries can do in terms of opening up the fiscal space so that one policy is not really constraining the ambitions in the direction that the country wants to go. And then, of course, on debt management, thank you very much for sharing some of the work that you're doing in terms of debt transparency and how that could actually improve on the interest rates that countries in the region are then charged. So thank you very much again to our distinguished panel. And with that, I want to send this back to Roland, our country manager, for her final closing remarks. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And thank you for thanking our panelists. We are well over time, but it was very hard to stop this discussion because there was clearly a lot of interest, high interest. There was a lot of content. And I think most of all, in addition to thanking our distinguished speakers for their contribution of their ideas and really the hard work that is being done on the ground in Rwanda, I would like to thank the participants for your interest, for your questions. We had over 200 people connected, as far as I could see, and I'm sure there were many others. I'd also like to thank the World Bank team members who authored this report and contributed to the report. We have circulated online the link for the report. It's huge. There is an executive summary, but it is huge with lots of rich data, lots of annexes that go very deep into many of these sectors, that look at different scenarios in terms of how the COVID crisis could further impact the country. And, from that is where we drew a lot of these recommendations. There's also a big team that supported the logistics for this event, particularly difficult in light of the huge thunderstorm that we had, but luckily we were able to stay online, and it's one of the reasons why we've gone over time. So I'd also like to thank them. And, just to leave a few reflections, Rwanda's national strategy for transformation is still highly relevant. And it sets out very clearly a shift from large public investment to private sector and human capital development as the main drivers of economic growth. And that's one of the reasons why we are so strongly focused here on what can be done to protect human capital development post-COVID. COVID-19 has strongly threatened to reverse the gains that Rwanda has made in human capital development and to derail the progress that we have been seeing in recent years. But the World Bank is of the view that continuing to pursue policy reforms in fiscal policy, education, social protection, and health will put a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable recovery very much in reach for Rwanda. And we commit to continuing to partner with the government to achieve this. I'd like very much if you continue the conversation on Twitter or other social media, hashtag Rwanda Economic Update, and hopefully we will see you again. We will be disseminating this in a lot of other fora, hopefully with the University of Rwanda and a couple of other NGOs and in other places where we can keep the conversation going. Murakoze Chane. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. I have 30 minutes.